Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Stoll, Vice President of the Stimson Center, and I'm really thrilled to have you join me for a very exciting event on great power and great responsibility in U.S. arms transfers. We'll also be launching a new report by CIVIC and the Stimson Center on this important and timely topic of reclaiming congressional oversight of U.S. arms sales. The sale and transfer of American-made weapons has really been an enduring feature of U.S. and economic policy economic and foreign policy, for decades. And we're seeing American presidents and lawmakers who've long touted the supported economic security and diplomatic of arms sales lend their support to various initiatives to sell more arms more quickly. This support has really helped secure the United States as the world's largest arms exporter. But flooding the world with arms certainly comes with obvious risks, including the risk that weapons will be used to attack innocent civilians and cause civilian harm. Mitigating the civilian harm is not only a moral imperative, but also an economic and strategic one. When civilians are killed or injured by US weapons, lucrative arms deals are jeopardized, international norms are eroded, and global insecurity tends to rise. Unfortunately, what we've seen, particularly in the last 4 years, is that the executive branch has increasingly prioritized the short-term benefits of arms sales at the expense of more enduring national interests. The war in Yemen, I think, is a particularly stark example where we've seen President Trump repeatedly cite the supposed economic benefits of arms sales to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners as a reason for continuing U.S. military support to these countries, even as we have ample evidence that they repeatedly use American-made weapons to attack civilians. Now, this short-sighted approach to arms sales is really unsustainable over the long term, and U.S. efforts to boost its arms exports can and should be accompanied by smarter ways to ensure that rising sales do not put more civilian lives at risk or undermine U.S. values and U.S. priorities. So in the new report we're launching today called Great Responsibility, a Legislative Reform Agenda for U.S. Arms Transfers and Civilian Harm, CIVIC and Stimson offer a roadmap for reforming the U.S. arms export system to minimize civilian harm. Specifically, our report looks at Congress, which we believe has relinquished a considerable amount of authority over arms exports to the executive branch over the years, how it can reclaim its oversight of U.S. arms sales and better ensure that American weapons are used responsibly. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. I do want to mention that this report is the sequel to the CIVIC Stimson 2018 report, With Great Power, Modifying U.S. Arms Sales to Reduce Civilian Harm, which focused on the laws, the regulations, the policies that are designed to prevent unintended consequences arising from U.S. arms transfers. So that report really looked at U.S. Existing controls and identified ways to modify the U.S. arms sales process to reduce civilian harm associated with U.S. sold weapons, while of course preserving the benefits of international arms sales. So I encourage you to look at both of these reports together to really get a holistic view of the tools we have to ensure that U.S. arms sales support U.S. interest. So I'm pleased to be joined by three really smart people on this subject that will draw all these lessons and links for us. And you can see them on our screen: Annie Shield, David Feit, and Diana Olbaum. So I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists now before we dive into a larger discussion. And I should also note that you should feel free to leave any questions that you might have for the panelists in the Q&A. And I will do my best as we get to the Q&A portion of our conversation to incorporate those into our dialogue. So let me first start with Annie Shield, who's one of the report's lead authors. Annie is the Senior Advisor for U.S. Policy and Advocacy at CIVIC, where she conducts policy research and advocacy around the civilian harm implications of U.S. military operations and security sector assistance. She's also a research program manager with Stanford University, where she leads research on the second and third order effects of conflicts on civilians. And prior to working with CIVIC and Stanford, Annie spent 3 years at the State Department, where she worked on human rights, civilian protection, and security sector reform as a founding member of DRL's Office of Security and Human Rights. We're also joined by David Feit, a senior professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee Majority Staff. David has spent years working to strengthen congressional oversight requirements of arms sales, including human rights considerations, and over U.S. security assistance generally. His responsibilities include oversight of U.S. security assistance, arms export licensing, authorization for use of military force legislation, counterterrorism, embassy security, and intelligence matters that are all before the committee. Previously, David served in the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and the Intelligence Research Division of the State Department. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Diana Olbaum, who's a senior strategist and legislative director for foreign policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Diana leads a team of 10 lobbyists at FCNL seeking a more ethical and effective U.S. approach to national and global security. She has extensive government experience, including serving as a senior professional staff member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and as a deputy director of USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives. I think those very impressive bios demonstrate why these are the people that you need to have in the room when you're talking about the role of Congress in arms transfers and ways to mitigate risk to civilians. So I want to start with Annie and turn things over to you to introduce the report and give us some of the report's top lines and recommendations. And hopefully all of you will be reading the report as we go along or after the report, so they're focusing entirely on you. Thanks, Annie, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. And first of all, a big thank you to Stimson for hosting and for partnering with us on this report. And I also want to say a big thank you to my amazing co-authors, Elena Crespo, Elizabeth Frey, and Dan Mahanti as well. So the report. So this report came out in recognition of the fact that far too often, and really across administrations, US arms sold abroad have been used to commit human rights abuses, resulted in harm to civilians caught in conflict, and have bolstered regimes that systematically violate human rights. And yet, despite the fact that arm transfers are actually the most common method through which the US involves itself in war, Congress lacks the oversight and power it needs to stop harmful sales. And in fact, even in cases of bipartisan opposition, as we've seen recently, Congress has never successfully blocked a notified arms transfer through legislation. And of course, this came to a head last year when President Trump used emergency powers to authorize the transfer of arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, despite, again, overwhelming bipartisan opposition. So we came to the idea of this report really with a lot of information about what's broken about the system. But what we wanted to do with this report was ask, what does good actually look like, right? What is our blue sky vision of reform to stop US arms from fueling conflict abroad and contributing to human suffering around the world? And the good news was that a lot of really smart people had already found creative ways to tackle parts of the problem. So really what this report does is tries to put all of those puzzle pieces together in one place. So it's based on in-depth analysis of reports and recommendations and advocacy from experts and organizations at the forefront of arms transfers reform. So these include folks, of course, like Stimson Center, like FCNL, Transparency International, American Bar Association, Cato Institute, Center for International Policy, and many more experts and organizations. And then we also analyzed previous legislative reform efforts to try and identify creative ideas and to try and draw on bills that have already been introduced, including bills introduced by Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Senators Ben Cardin, Chris Murphy, and Robert Menendez, among others. And so on that note, I want to make sure that I say that my fellow panelists, Diana, David, and Rachel, really are the people who have been at the forefront of this issue and enormously influential in pushing for these ideas for very many years. So I want to say a personal thank you to all of you for your work and really for the inspiration for this report. So what is the agenda? So I want to start with the key problems that we identified through this process. The first is that the executive branch does not sufficiently weigh human rights, risks of civilian harm, and corruption risks in arms transfer decisions, which of course, as I mentioned, was confirmed by the recent state OIG report on US arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The second problem is that it's far too easy for the executive branch to circumvent congressional oversight over arms sales decisions. And the third is that the arms transfer process is extremely opaque to the public, right? It precludes appropriate public scrutiny and debate about arms transfer decisions. So based on these concerns, we identified 3 key pillars or buckets of action for congressional reform. And I'll go through them briefly. So the first is using legislation to clarify the requirements and responsibilities of the executive branch in making decisions regarding arms transfers in order to mitigate against human rights, civilian harm, and corruption risks. So this means requiring that pre-sale decision-making processes explicitly weigh human rights and civilian harm, and ensuring that governments with problematic records of harm or governments who may be likely to cause harm in the future do not receive US weapons. And then after a sale, it also means strengthening post-sale monitoring of how US weapons are actually used. Some really fantastic examples of this already exist. For example, in the Safeguard Act, recently introduced by Senators Menendez, Leahy, and Kaine, in Congresswoman Omar's Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act, and in Senator Murray's Values and Arms Export Act of 2020. I know that David will speak more about the Menendez and Co. bill, but again, I do just want to say how grateful we are for their leadership on these issues. Bucket number 2 is taking back congressional power. So this includes legislative fixes that strengthen congressional authority and oversight, such as limiting the president's use of emergency powers to sell arms and changing congressional procedures so that Congress has to proactively approve risky sales for them to move forward. And that's something that I know that Diana will speak more about as well. And then it also means just ensuring that Congress gets the information that it needs in order to make decisions about problematic sales. So things like closing loopholes that allow for the evasion of congressional notifications, making those notifications more detailed, and making sure that Congress knows when terms of sale have been violated. And then the last bucket is increasing public transparency and awareness around arms sales. So this includes things like mandating additional reporting from the executive branch and from defense companies around things like offset and co-production agreements, lobbying, and political contributions. And then also the regular use by Congress of hearings, of public notices, and other means of communication to ensure that the public is better informed about the arms transfer process. So these 3 buckets, right? Number 1, clarifying the responsibilities of the executive branch. Number 2, taking back congressional power and oversight. And number 3, increasing public transparency, represent a complementary, mutually reinforcing areas of much needed reform, right? So essentially, one way or another, we do need all of them. So I'll leave it at that, but really looking forward to this discussion. And of course, as I said, really grateful to David, to Diana, and so many others whose work this report was based on for pushing these ideas forward.
Thanks, Annie. I mean, obviously, I'm a little bit biased, and I think this is a really fantastic report. But I do think it serves, as you said, it's really a comprehensive look at all of the ways in which we can reform the entire sort of arms transfer process from the executive all the way through sort of public awareness of these issues to make a difference. And you mentioned in your comments that and you mentioned some specific examples, but there's a lot of meat in this report. And so I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on some of the specific examples of the legislative fixes you mentioned that could really force the executive to better consider human rights and civilian harm, so that when Congress is getting those deals, they don't have to first start and legislate that element of the actual transfer.
Yeah, absolutely. So the basic idea, right, is that human rights and civilian harm considerations should be part of the entire arms sales decision-making process in the executive branch. So I won't go through all of our examples, but some examples include making human rights and international humanitarian law a more explicit and binding part of standard terms and conditions for arms sales, requiring the State Department to create risk profiles of potential buyers based on an objective analysis of things like likelihood of corruption, violations of IHL or human rights, the unapproved transfer of weapons, things like that, sharing that analysis with Congress, demonstrating steps that they've taken to mitigate suspected risks if they do proceed with a sale, and then also evaluating and reporting on the effectiveness of those mitigation steps. Clarifying the application of the Leahy law to all foreign military sales. That's something that the Menendez bill does do, which would be huge. Promoting accountability for arms sales decisions by designating a senior State Department official responsible for overseeing interagency coordination on arms sales. and also responsible for signing off on human rights certification processes. And then after a sale, also, things like requiring that all end-use monitoring programs explicitly monitor use and behavior, which they do not do currently, including human rights violations and violations of IHL.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and we can delve into sort of the conventional arms transfer policy changes writ large as well, in terms of the direction that those who are making those decisions sort of have to take. But I want to just, and I think we'll probably quibble a little bit about this, and David may have a different view than me. But you could say that Congress needs to take back its congressional oversight and power, or you could say they never had it really to begin with. But are there other ways in which we can see, maybe not take back, but assert, that Congress could assert its power and oversight over arms transfers?
Yes. So regardless of how we got here, I'll highlight a few ways to take back or assert that power. The first thing I'll say is that we wholeheartedly support the kind of quote unquote flip the script initiative that I know Diana will talk more about, so I will not steal her thunder on that because she's the expert there, but we do highlight that in the report. But I'll just highlight a few other key changes to enhance congressional power, right? So number one would be limiting the president's ability to sell arms through emergency powers, so that emergency powers are actually used to address true emergencies and not just to circumvent Congress, which again, we saw happen last year. So that might mean limiting emergency sales to equipment that can actually be transferred within a 30-day period, so that you know that you're responding to an actual emergency, and requiring a detailed justification by the executive branch of how that equipment would fill a critical emergent gap. The bipartisan Saudi Arabia False Emergencies SAFE Act is one fantastic example that does that. Another example would be, again, closing loopholes that allow the executive branch to evade congressional scrutiny. So the Arms Export Control Act requires congressional notifications of sales above a certain dollar threshold. Multiple administrations have evaded this requirement through the use of multiple lower denominational transfers that fall below that threshold for notification. So for example, in 2011 and 2012, the Obama administration surpassed congressional notification for sales to Bahrain in this way, and those sales continued even after the Bahraini government tear-gassed and beat anti-government protesters. And then the recent state OIG report found the same thing with the Trump administration, that the Trump administration used those lower denominational sales to sell PGM components and other things to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which allowed the approval of these items that Congress had previously placed holds on. So to close that loophole, one way to do that would be for Congress to require a congressional notification once the total monetary value of smaller transfers to that country in a fiscal year exceed the existing financial threshold for notification of a single sale. So once you get to that single sale threshold, no matter how many small sales you've done, you would need to notify that. And then the last thing is that, or the last thing I'll highlight, is that when the executive does fail to hold end users of US weapons accountable for violations of human rights and IHL, Congress can and should bar arms transfers to specific countries conditional upon specific behavioral changes and compliance with human rights and IHL.
Thanks, Annie. I know there are lots. I can see the questions already appearing in the chat that will be relevant to you, and we'll come back to them, I promise. But I want to turn now to David Feit, who I think I might have said majority staff, and maybe I'm having like a moment of clairvoyance for the elections in like 22 days, but currently 2 days, maybe currently minority staff. But I'd like to turn to you next, David, because you have spent your career not just on the Hill, but even prior to that in the executive branch, really thinking about these issues. And so I want to turn to you to not only highlight this new legislation that we've seen your bosses introduce, but also to sort of give your larger perspectives on why are we still having this debate 25 years after, I was still started having this debate with you, that this is a perpetual conversation that we're having about the role of Congress in arms transfers.
Well, thank you very much for that and for the introduction and for your kind prophetic words that hopefully in January will be realized, and I will be a member of the majority staff But be that as it may, I'm honored to be here today. I'm honored to serve in the capacity that I serve, and this has turned into be a bit of a calling. So thank you very much. And on that question that you've just asked, we could spend a couple of hours talking about that. How did we get here? But first I have to issue a disclaimer that my remarks reflect my personal views and should not necessarily be taken to represent those of the SFRC, either minority or majority staff, or that of the ranking member. I'd also like to start off by adding my praise and abject admiration for the CIVIC product. It is one of the most comprehensive efforts I've seen. It provides a really full roadmap and resource for anyone who seeks to be interested in how the process works and how it can be improved. So it's unlike, I think, a lot of Washington products, which you just come out and you put on the shelf once they're out. This one I think is going to endure and serve as a guidepost. So thank you for that. To the issue at hand, which is human rights and arms sales, I'm sensing that there's a greater awareness in the Congress over the last couple of years that something significant is missing in how the United States does arms sales. And that is, to put it bluntly, the lack of a Hippocratic Oath equivalent, that at the very least, for whatever purposes that we should be selling arms to foreign countries, we should at the least be doing no harm in those sales to the innocent. And this has been, as has been pointed out already, come to mind, I think, in the minds, certainly in the Senate, I think also to some extent in the House. First is the whole war in Yemen has gone a long way toward crystallizing this view. That and US support for Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led coalition and the results of that war, the air war in Yemen specifically. Also, the Secretary of State's declaration of an emergency last year to be able to sell, among 21 other sales, nearly 60,000 more precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia was another clarifying moment, I think, for the Congress. The emergency was clearly the inability or unwillingness of the Secretary to justify the sale in light of Senator Menendez's demand to prove that such sales were not being misused by the Saudis for human rights violations and were actually improving Saudi observance of the requirements of international humanitarian law, as the administration had so often claimed. And I think the fundamental problem is one that our previous speaker has gotten to. There is no requirement in law for human rights to actually be considered in the process of considering whether or not to sell arms or defense services abroad. In the Arms Export Control Act, which is the foundational document that governs this, you will not find the term human rights in there. And that's not to diss the AECA, it is a product of its times, which is the late 60s, mid 70s, growing out of the Arms Control and Disarmament Act, the Cold War, disarmament, concerns with arm races, building up our allies' ability to resist aggression, and protecting our own technology. And human rights was somewhat implicit in that, but it's not explicit. And this is important because with its absence, then all you're left with is discretion. While all implementation of law is to some extent at the discretion of administration, at least the extent of its implementation, not having human rights in the foundational statute or in the statutes at all in this area as a purpose and consideration for sale and use of arms to foreign countries leaves it entirely up to the discretion of an administration to decide how or even if it considers human rights concerns in the arms trade. And what we have seen over the years is administration to administration to administration. Some do it a little bit more, some do it a little bit less, but it's not a fundamental purpose or policy to make sure that human rights are not only not harmed, but actually promoted by these sales. So Senator Menendez with Senators Leahy and Kaine have introduced to this effect S 4712, the Safeguarding Human Rights in Arms Sales Act, or the Safeguard Act. And this bill reforms and updates the Arms Export Control Act to account for human rights concerns. It sets protection of human rights as a standalone policy outside of the AECA, and it enhances congressional oversight of arms sales to countries that engage in specific human rights abuses, not to prohibit sales, but to give the Congress the oversight authority it needs to weigh the sale against US policy to protect and promote human rights. So to go into some of the provisions of the bill, this first section 2, Statement of Policy on Control of Defense Exports and Protection of Human Rights, this elevates the protection of human rights in the control and export of defense articles, and that the transfer of such articles and services should serve to encourage governments to fully comply with international humanitarian law and observe internationally recognized human rights. Next section, prohibition of arms sales to countries committing genocide or war crimes, because why would we want to do that anyway? But it needs to be said. Section 4, about the misuse of arms sales for human rights abuses. This requires that you have to have an agreement with the government of the country before they can buy defense articles or services that these will not be used to commit human rights abuses. Adds as a requirement in the Arms Export Control Act for a country to be even eligible for arms sales, that the sale is unlikely to contribute to human rights abuses. The country has agreed that the use of such article or services will not be used in commission of such abuses, that an authorized purpose for sales is for legitimate internal security needs, not just internal security, and there is a difference in those two usages, and that such defense articles and defense services will not present a significant risk of being used to violate international humanitarian law or internationally recognized human rights. The next section, section 5, consideration of human rights and democratization in arms exports. Now, this does a couple of things. It strengthens the requirement for the State Department to consider the country's entire human rights record. Under the conventional arms transfer policy of the previous administration, this was something that they had to do. This administration removed that from its version in April 2017 of the conventional arms transfer policy, restricting the human rights review only to whether this particular sale could be used in the commission of human rights violation, or, and this is something that it added, which is good, used in the commission of harm against civilians in combat. That's a positive, but it's a significant narrowing of what considerations are being done. The other main thing this particular provision does is that it elevates, well, it puts into law that DRL, the Human Rights Bureau at state, has a seat at the table, and an important seat at the table in considering, to bringing human rights considerations to arms sales review. Now, DRL already has a seat at the table, but in fact, it's not listened to that closely in these considerations. As a matter of fact, because of this, DRL self-censors itself. It has to pick and choose what sales it's really going to comment on, the most egregious ones, and which ones to let go by. So this, it says in statute, DRL has an important role, and that's important that Congress is endorsing this. But the next provision is perhaps as important, which requires that the State Department Inspector General report to us in Congress for 5 years how well State Department and PM Bureau is doing in this process of listening to DRL. This is to change the bureaucratic culture. If the State Department knows that the IG is reporting to us for 5 years, a long period of time, and things are not, and DRL is not actually being given ample consideration, other unfortunate consequences in legislation may follow from that. Now, it's possible we could have put in here that DRL would have a veto capability over sales, for example, or to enhance the role. The problem with that is once you increase the visibility in this way, you're also increasing the risk of an unscrupulous administration, perhaps putting someone in charge of DRL that would undermine its fundamental purpose. So this is trying to strike a balance in enhancing DRL's role and in changing the bureaucratic culture without coming with an unfortunate consequence of that. Number 6, section 6, the enhancement of congressional oversight of human rights and arms exports. What this does is it enunciates that if the Secretary of State has credible information that a particular country is engaging in named human rights abuses, rape, ethnic cleansing, use of child soldiers, wrongful detention, extrajudicial killings, then for a period of 2 years, everything to that country, it comes to the Congress for us to take a look at and to review and possibly enact a joint resolution of disapproval. As is mentioned earlier, right now there are thresholds, the lowest one being $14 million of goods, of value in the sale before Congress gets involved in the review. This, if you're a human rights abuser for 2 years, we would see everything, just to have that extra check on this country because of its human rights practices, which hopefully will only increase our oversight, but have a deterrent and salutary effect on those countries. Section 7, the limitation on sales to security forces involved in gross violation of human rights, applies the Leahy Law finally to arms sales and defense services that are not themselves funded by taxpayer money through FMF. This also includes commercial sales. State has, in my opinion, misinterpreted the Foreign Assistance Acts for years, saying that Leahy stuff, not about arms sales, about all the other stuff. This makes it clear. Section 8, in-use monitoring of misuse of arms and human rights abuses. This requires the State Department to, after the things are shipped, to ensure, to check, to make sure that US origin arms are not being used for human rights abuses. You would think this is already being done, but it's not. It's being done episodically, but it's not a requirement for the US government to check up on. Let's see, Section 9, human rights elements and auxiliary reports. It's just adding something. Section 10, requirement for certain weapons to be subject to conditions and in-use monitoring of foreign military sales. Forgive me, but this one really gets to me. One of the unfortunate developments of the last 10 years is that the State Department has been allowing things that used to go for military sales, government to government, to be sold commercially. Why is this important? Government to government, the contract is not done until state administration is done with it and the Congress reviews it, and then the final contract is done. Commercial sales, it's the opposite. For a defense exporter to get a commercial export license, the contract has to be done and signed and then submitted to the State Department, including not only delivery timelines, but also potential penalties for non-compliance. So what happens? A commercial sale comes to up of now precision guided munitions, as in last year. As a commercial sale, you ask State Department, we think there should be some assurances on this of non-use, some other conditionalities, and state will come back and say, sorry, the contract is fixed. We really can't change it. We can either reject it or we have to go along with it. And you have the defense exporter coming into your office and saying, oh my God, if you don't approve this thing right away, the penalty clauses are going to kick in and we're going to lose this much money and that many jobs, and it's just going to be, then the sky is going to fall. So what this does is reiterate the authority that state actually already has and lists a whole list of very lethal weapons that have to go for military sales, which means conditions can be put on those sales, assurances can be gotten on those sales before the contract has to go through, and Congress can influence that. And finally, oversight of export of silencers to foreign non-governmental persons. State Department really recently changed its regulations to say, okay, maybe we will allow the export of silencers and sound suppressors to people who are not government officials. Why in the name of God would you want to do this? So this is saying, if you're going to do that, let us take a look at it before you do that. And the final observation that I have is, as alluded to earlier, it's just a little quibble of how much does Congress relinquish its power, has Congress not asserted its power? And I would say to some extent, yes. It's not so much we relinquished power, we never had a heck of a lot to start with on this regard, and we were really kneecapped in the early 80s by the Chadha Supreme Court decision, which got rid of the concurrent resolution of disapproval. It is true that Congress has heretofore not asserted itself as fully as possible, and that there's a lot of interest in doing that now internally, as well as, thank you, externally, to try to change this tremendous imbalance of power that exists on the oversight of arms sales. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. I appreciate that really sort of digestible summary of the legislation. You all should still read it, but it was a really helpful to have you sort of run through the provisions. I do want to sort of widen the aperture a little bit and talk about the sort of why now. You know, is this legislation and sort of even this discussion that we're having today, is it really, in your view, sort of the result of both actions and inactions by the executive branch, and particularly by the Trump administration, that we need this kind of clarification? You mentioned some examples in your remarks about ways in which things have been interpreted, maybe not as thoroughly as was intended, that the AECA is just, frankly, it was written in a different time and space. And it, it's always good to sort of refresh and review sort of what the provisions are. But what do you think is sort of the motivating force, as someone who's seen sort of this conversation for a long time in this town?
Well, it's interesting. In my opinion, Congress goes through periods of dominant perceptions about things. And for many years, I would say up till about, well, actually sort of the beginning of the Yemen war, actually 2015, the dominant perception was export promotion. And unfortunately, arms sales have become more and more seen as normal commodities for export. Not only this combined with the need to build partner capacity as part of our longstanding double-decade counterterrorism initiative, all of this comes together in sort of a pro arms sale point of view, in much that we need to do this quicker, faster, and the emphasis has been so much on efficiency of process, on getting things out the door and into the hands of our partners so that they can use them without really, and that's sort of been the dominant perception, I would say. That is starting to shift, I think, again, largely, well, for two reasons. One is the as I've said, the war in Yemen, and the gap between how this war has been prosecuted, this air war by the Saudis, on a continuing basis, as well as the administration's, plural, support for that, has become very difficult to ignore. And you have a very restive Congress doing resolutions against U.S. involvement in the war, providing refueling services, and looking at arms sales. And that's the second thing too. I don't know if you've ever seen this movie, Anne of a Thousand Days, way back when. And there's a scene in there where Cardinal Wolsey talks to Cromwell, and he says, you should never tell the king what he can do, only what he ought to do. And what has happened is that, at least in the Senate, senators have discovered the joint resolution of disapproval, and that's expedited. And you don't need anybody's permission to bring that to the floor of the US Senate for a vote. So in the 21 and a half years I've been doing this, the only time I've been on the floor for an arms sales resolution has been in the last 5 years, when suddenly senators are like, this is a great way to either oppose this sale, which they may do, to get a discussion on the sale and on the country. And so there is this sort of union between something is wrong and we have some tools to do something about it. So all of a sudden people are getting, I think there's this very positive reinforcement in terms of doing something about this process and rebalancing the arms sales process. And the emergency declaration last year was very useful to that, because that did, more than anything else, got us bipartisan support for 22 separate resolutions of disapproval, never been done, thank you very much, and on a bipartisan basis. So this administration in some ways has actually been very helpful, in that it's been very clear about what its purposes for arms sales are, which according to the president, is profit.
Thanks, David. I think that you raise an important and interesting point, that the war in Yemen has really allowed sort of this cohesiveness and this nonpartisan approach to discussing arms sales, right? That it's been so shocking and so horrific, and there's such fear of U.S. complicity in persecuting these events, that I wonder if you think that it's sort of an exception, or do you think Congress is actually becoming more receptive to human rights considerations in regards to arms sales in perhaps other places outside of sort of this one context? Are we going to see sort of this change in perspective as the legislation you just mentioned really looks, it doesn't specify, one country, it really looks at arms sales holistically? Do you think that's sort of a trend that we will see, that we have more receptiveness by Congress to arms sales and human rights violations?
I think so. I hope so. I would like to think so. There's also, what I've noticed in the Congress over the years is that you need a precipitating event. it can be a very specific, limited, and yet it can be illustrative of a larger thing. And if once that happens and the perception begins to change, then you can start, there's more receptiveness to legislating on a general basis to do that. And I would like to think that we're kind of on the cusp of that right now. Certainly by the number of bills that are being put out there, we're seeing these things show up now in the National Defense Authorization Act exercise in both chambers. So there is this sense of development.
Great, thanks. I know there are many questions for you, but I want to turn it over to Diana, who can talk a little bit about, as Annie referenced in her opening remarks as well, this notion of flipping the script on arms sales, and why, given everything that Annie and David just raised, why is this sort of a sensible approach to how we view U.S. arms transfer decisions? So Diana, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I really appreciate being on this very distinguished panel with David, who helped craft this incredibly exciting new legislation, and Annie, who authored this fabulous new report. So thank you for inviting me to participate. Let me just back up a little, because I know a lot of this discussion has been pretty dense, and I just want to restate that I think all of us on the panel are agreed on the basic problem definition, which is that the United States is selling or enabling the sale of arms that are used to violate human rights, fuel corruption, or otherwise harm civilians, that these violations are completely predictable. We know in advance that there are significant risks that the weapons will be used to inflict these types of harm, and therefore we're fully complicit in these abuses. The third point is that there's not only a moral cost to this, but also significant damage to our national reputation and our national security. Having US bombs directly responsible for the deaths of Yemeni school children cannot possibly serve US interests. And finally, Congress is almost entirely unable to stop even the most egregiously wrong-headed sales, which is why we're talking about this flip the script idea. But as much as some may want to blame the Trump administration or greedy military contractors for this problem, I'm going to take a little bit of issue with David and posit that it is a problem of Congress's own making. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires the arms sales system to work the way it does. Congress created this system through the Arms Export Control Act. And yes, earlier efforts to get this under control were hobbled by the INS versus Chadha decision in 1983, which effectively ruled out the one house veto. But honestly, anytime Congress wants to get serious, they have the power to make this whole problem go away. So Congress is both complicit in the problem and also perhaps the best hope of its solution. So the good news, as you've been hearing, is that members of Congress are increasingly recognizing this problem and starting to do something about it. You've heard from David about the Safeguard Act and its approach to controlling these dangerous sales. I think all the points that he laid out about his bill are really important and useful reforms, and I hope the legislation will move forward early in the next Congress, if not in this one. There's also another approach reflected in a bill introduced by Senator Patty Murray, S. 4739, the Values in Arms Export Act of 2020. So this bill also enhances the role of human rights in arms sales decisions, but through a very different process. It requires all US government employees who are stationed overseas to report action or behavior that is inconsistent with internationally recognized principles of human rights, and creates a process for moving that information up the chain to the Secretary of State and to Congress. And that's so important because so many of our current laws really don't have a triggering mechanism. They call for arms sales to stop if the Secretary of State makes a determination, and those determinations never come. So this bill also creates a program of DoD monitoring and verification of the use of US defense articles and defense services after they're transferred to other countries. This is something that's currently lacking. It creates an oversight board that would ensure human rights and the laws of armed conflict are considered in arms sales. And it would ban arms sales for at least 3 years to designated countries of concern, which specifically includes Saudi Arabia and the UAE. There's also a proposal out there by Representative Ilhan Omar, which is, I would say, more of a policy change than a process change. It basically bans security assistance and arms sales to human rights violators rather than changing the way that arms are notified to Congress. And then the final approach in legislation that is currently being drafted but has not yet been introduced focuses on restoring the congressional role in making arms sales decisions. So under the current process, arms sales over a certain threshold are notified to Congress, and they proceed unless Congress enacts a joint resolution of disapproval. So in other words, the president can sell arms unless Congress stops him or her. So in practical terms, this means that to stop an arms transfer, 2/3 of both houses must agree to override a presidential veto. And that bar is so high that has never been reached. And as others have mentioned, Congress has never stopped any arms sale by joint resolution of disapproval. They've banned certain countries from receiving arms through legislative sanctions. They've succeeded in having the administration withdraw or amend sales by using these resolutions as leverage, but it's not really a realistic pathway to stopping a sale. So what this approach would do is flip the script. Instead of allowing arms sales to proceed unless Congress disapproves them, we would prohibit arms sales unless Congress gives them explicit affirmative approval. Now, recognizing that there are hundreds of arms sale notifications every year, the bulk of which are not particularly objectionable, although we at FCNL oppose all arms sales, it's not practical at this point to require congressional approval for each and every arms sale. That would just require too many floor votes and tie up what I can say I feel is an already dysfunctional system. So we can start by applying the new process only to the specific countries and the specific types and quantities of weapons that are most likely to be problematic. And for those high-risk sales, we want to shift the burden of proof. No sale unless a majority of both houses of Congress say yes. Now, there are plenty of other steps that Congress can take to stem the flow of arms to countries that are likely to misuse them. What I love about Annie's report is that it's like this whole menu, a whole list of options to choose from. A few of my favorites are the ones about limiting the emergency exceptions so that the president can't bypass Congress by declaring a fake emergency, which is something that Rachel and I have written about previously. I love the idea about conducting risk assessments so that before the sale is completed, you have actually given some thought to the likelihood that it would be misused. And also the point about restoring oversight of firearms to the State Department instead of treating guns and ammunition like commercial exports. So I'll just say, as we look to the future, I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to be successful in bringing this under control for 3 reasons. Number one, it's not a partisan issue. The truth is that the Obama administration also made a huge number of ill-advised and harmful arms sales, just as the current administration has. There's plenty of blame to go around. The second is, as David has indicated, Congress is already starting to claw back its authorities over whether and when we go to war and who we sell weapons to. There's been bipartisan outrage at the war in Yemen and the behavior of the Saudi and UAE governments. As you know, both houses voted to end US support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen and prevent arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And finally, we've been talking to offices all across the Hill, Democrats and Republicans, and And we're seeing strong interest on both sides of the aisle in making some of these fixes. And it's not just from members who are new to the Washington power scene and don't know how things work. It's from members who have the real power to do this, like Senator Menendez. And we think that in the next Congress, there's going to be increasing appetite to move these bills, no matter who is president. That's not to say it won't be hard. It definitely will be hard. But I think there's growing recognition around the country that the current approach isn't working. In fact, 75% of Democrats and 62% of Republicans in a recent poll said that selling weapons to other countries makes the US less safe. And I think it's time for Washington to listen. So thank you.
Thanks, Diana. I'm sold. I'm ready to flip the script. So I'm on board, and I don't want to temper that enthusiasm and commitment. But I think I have to ask if this is so much of this is common sense, right? And is really, I mean, even as David mentioned, like the fact that we don't have to look at a country's previous human rights record to use that to anticipate what they may do in the future, it sort of, defies our sort of realities. But I wonder if because this seems so obvious to those of us who are working on this, could you talk about what you think might be some of the obstacles to passing this kind of legislation, or why this approach hasn't yet taken hold?
Absolutely. I don't know. I think there's three big reasons. The first is the really obvious lobbying from the arms industry. The weapons manufacturers are far more powerful on Capitol Hill than the human rights community. They donate huge sums to political campaigns. They hire high-powered lobbyists, unlike myself, and they divide up their manufacturing process. So there are components being manufactured in practically every district across the country. So there's this economic incentive that David also talked about, just treating this as an economic boon for the economy instead of thinking about the blowback that we get from selling these arms all over. The second is the issue of congressional weakness. I think Congress, as a general rule, sees little advantage in taking political responsibility for its decisions. It's way easier to let the administration make the hard calls and then criticize them if you don't like it than it is to actually have to be the ones who are called weak if you don't make the sale, or mistaken if you do approve it. So it's really important for Congress to kind of build up the muscles of taking responsibility for decisions. And then the third problem, I think, is public apathy. It's not really so much that the public doesn't care if you ask them about it, but on the list of priorities, it's really, really hard to get voters excited about these issues. They're complicated, they're arcane. There's dozens of other issues that hit closer to home. And so, Congress, for all the things you can criticize, they really do listen to their constituents. And if there were, really organized groups who kept pushing this, I think we'd get a different answer. And I know I at FCNL am working really hard to make that happen.
Thanks. No, I think those are really good points. And I think that your sort of last point about there are so many issues, particularly at this moment in time, right? We're dealing with a global pandemic. Our kids are not in school in all places, et cetera. There's a lot of pressing issues. And when you're writing to your member of Congress to do something, this is certainly not at the top. It's the same for those of us who've been working on these issues. These aren't the most well-funded issues by foundations or other philanthropies. And so it's really challenging, I think, to keep that momentum. So I do think that this is a really interesting concept, because as you said in sort of your point one, this is really a nonpartisan issue. There's both plenty of blame to go around for irresponsible or unadvised or ill-advised arms sales, but there's also lots of examples of where we've seen in the last 50 years, both Republicans and Democrats really trying to take steps to mitigate some of these risks. And so I'm wondering, just as we're thinking about, this is we're very close to an election, do you have any insights on what sort of either a Trump 2 administration or a Biden administration would think about these ideas? Because in some ways, it does curtail some executive authority, but it also, as you said, sort of shares the blame or the responsibility for decisions that may be unpopular.
Well, I have to be honest in saying I don't expect if there were to be another Trump administration for them to change the way they're looking at these, which is a very broad assertion of executive authority and viewing of arms sales as a commercial trade with no particular thought to the harm that it might cause. But I'm really hopeful that if there's a Biden administration, they would look quite favorably upon this, because this flip the script idea was actually based on a bill that Senator Biden introduced. I believe it was 86. I'll have to go back and look at the old bill. It's old enough, though, that it's actually, the text is not online. But we have it. It exists, and the draft that we're working on is based on that. So I think he does have a pretty strong respect for the role of Congress in these decisions, and we'll see, how it happens. What we might see is a little bit of changing of the political dynamics in Congress, where you'd see, if there's a Democratic president, there might be a lot more Republicans who are willing to sign on to limiting the president's authority, and maybe we might lose a few Democrats.
Thanks. There are so many questions. I have to actually put my glasses on so I can read all of the questions that have come in through the chat. I was going to try and sort of group some of these together, because I think you guys have been really stimulating sort of thoughts of our participants in terms of, how do you unpack some of these? So, what, for example, Diana, on Flip the Script, what weapon systems, what countries are you thinking this would be most applicable to? And then, David, would that then be an attractive sort of subsection per Diana's sort of main point that you can't look at all notifications that come through Congress? That would be all that Congress would do if even they would get through all of them. So does that sort of approach make sense, or are there other approaches? We'll start there, and then I'll continue to try and group these together.
So the legislation we're working on kind of works from the existing process that treats countries other than NATO, Japan, Australia, Korea, Israel, and New Zealand as the other countries that currently have a longer notification period would be the ones who would get would have the flipped script. And for weapons that are firearms and ammunition over 1 million, and air-to-ground munitions, tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, and training over 14 million. And those, like that 14 million ceiling, is already one that's in the Arms Export Control Act. The idea would be that you could package sales together. So if you had 10 notifications come in, you could package them together and pass them all together, and hopefully create a process by which things could be easily stripped out of that package, so that you're not hiding a really bad sale among a bunch of ones that are less controversial. Getting the process and the procedures right, so that there's the people who want arms sales to go through have some guarantee that they will at least be considered, while making sure that we don't set up a train that just keeps moving ahead, speeding without control. Finding those exact procedures is the hardest part.
David?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting concept, and it's a good concept to try to get at a particular worrying subset of concerns. And the big question is, what's the best way to slice that to both have a real impact, as well as to be able to get that approach passed through the Congress and signed by a president. So for example, I mean, if for one thing, if you eliminated, say, the NATO plus 5 states, that would take a big concern out of there, right? Well, now we have a problem child in, so to speak, in NATO these days. So there's to be some problem with that. But in general, if you don't do this to NATO plus the other plus 5, then you're looking at the rest of the world, and that becomes a much easier issue to get at, I think, for members. If you were to do about some sort of activity, such as countries that happen to be currently in combat against an international border, that there has to be an approval of that sort, that might be good. Relating to certain sorts of, again, human rights abuses that are documented by whomever, and that's one of the questions as to who pulls the trigger on that. I think those are all very useful to get at, and particularly focusing on a subset rather than have everything to be approved. So I think that's really the way to go. Just one other sort of a tangential observation: there is a precedent for this in current law, in the nuclear cooperation agreements, Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act. And it says that for a normal agreement with a country for nuclear cooperation, if it meets all these non-proliferation and safety and standards, it goes through unless Congress enacts a resolution of disapproval. However, if it doesn't meet any one of these conditions, then it can only go through if Congress passes a resolution of approval. So what's being proposed does have a precedent in law. And I think that's actually useful to point to, because that's when moving forward with these proposals.
Thanks to both of you. There's a couple questions. You both mentioned thresholds, sort of what those tipping points are. So there's a question about, how difficult would it be for the administration to make notification of arms sales below certain threshold levels. So the 14 million was mentioned. There's $1 million threshold for small arms and light weapons, but perhaps sort of combining sort of the threshold idea with the flip the script idea and this needing approval framework. Is it going to overwhelm Congress? Is Congress appropriately staffed to deal with that? I think that's sort of question one. And two, sort of to Annie's points, what would the risk threshold be? So we have this sort of dollar threshold, but like at what point do we say this is a particularly risky sale? How do we define that risk? Is it only looking at previous behavior, or what we sort of can reasonably assume is likely to happen? How do you define that risk? So both the sort of risk and threshold aspect is that overwhelm Congress, but then also this notion of risk in terms of risky behavior.
Thanks so much for that question, Rachel. It is really hard to determine risk on a global basis. Like if you're just going to talk about names of countries and types of weapons, it's a really hard thing to do. So one of the things that I like about some of Annie's proposals and some of the things that are in David's bill and some of the other bills is this kind of risk assessment of having some body or some way of flagging particular countries and particular sales that should be of concern, because David is probably the only one on the Democratic side of the committee who sees these arms sales. And I remember what it's like. You have them stacking up in your box and you have to kind of figure out which ones are the ones you want to spend your time and energy on. It's a lot of work. And so it helps to have that external flag that this is one that you really need to look at. Again, like I said, the flip the script proposal really just focuses on categories of countries and weapons. But I definitely see the advantage in having people have a real trained eye on particular situations.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that this is a really good example, this question of why we need all of these three buckets, right? These different categories. So for the flip the script example, for example, as Diana and David both kind of laid out, in order to be politically possible, you need to decrease the number of notifications that Congress is going to need to deal with. So things like taking out NATO plus, things like focusing on the weapons that are most likely to cause harm. And based on analysis of previous years, that leaves you with about 60 votes or 60 notifications a year, which again, as Diana mentioned, can be packaged together. And then of course, you can still use the old disapproval procedures for all other sales, right? For NATO plus, for everything else. So you still have those tools in your arsenal. But then even before anything ever gets to Congress, that's where you need all of those other things that Diana was just talking about, like the risk assessments, like applying Leahy to arms sales, all of those things to make sure that the executive branch is actually doing its job and doing its due diligence before it even gets to Congress. And then at the same time, making sure that Congress has those checks back to the executive.
The setting the questions of thresholds is a really thorny issue, because you want to make sure you catch what you really want to see and not miss anything else through just random chance. The dollar thresholds that are currently in the Arms Export Control Act, which is how we see things in Congress, is a default mechanism. It basically says if something is really expensive in terms of sale, then it's something you should take a look at, not because of any inherent lethality or to who it's going to or anything like that. And it has worked pretty well for that and it's also impersonal and it's objective. Nobody is really is actually saying, we can't send this because it's below threshold, it's above threshold. Generally, the State Department, although there have been some lapses, does respect those thresholds, because if they know that we ever caught them, then unfortunate things would happen to them in legislation, like reducing thresholds even further, either lower than they are now rather than increasing them, which is what they in the industry would like have. Actually, Diana and I did an attempt back in 2012 when we tried to rewrite the FAA and the Arms Export Control Act in a completely fun and somewhat delusional exercise. And one of the things we're attempting to do in that was to get rid of the dollar thresholds, or at least condition them, so that you were trying to incorporate circumstances of concern. First introduction of a system into an area or into a region of conflict, then that would trigger something coming up to us. But the issue of saying who determines what the threshold is to come to us with an administration, no matter which one it is, which will always be interested in reducing the number of things that Congress sees, and Congress would like to see more of it in general. It's a very interesting issue to get into, and one that would be very fruitful to engage with everybody more extensively.
So I have quite a few questions about sort of the role of the executive, and not just the State Department, but also the role of the Defense Department, sort of where it fits in both, and we talked about this a little bit, sort of the outsized influence that DoD might have in some of these decisions, the undersized influence that DRL might be having, whether it's its own self-censoring or just the realities of the deliberations. But can we talk a little bit about both the role of the executive, so the State Department and Defense Department, but also the receptiveness of the executive branch to some of these proposed reforms? Because as you just said, David, there's always going to be, the executive wants to give Congress less information. Congress is always going to want more information. But it goes back to this notion of arms transfers are not just the domain of one branch of government, right? That there really is, and there needs to be a holistic view of how arms sales are being used to advance U.S. interests, how they could be potentially undermining U.S. Both security concerns and moral and ethical considerations, as well as long-term relationships with particular countries. So I wonder if we could switch a little bit and talk about both the role of and receptiveness to these reforms by the executive.
If I may, you're absolutely right. The executive is not going to welcome whatever executive is actually not going to welcome these reforms. No matter what, again, what administration is, because whatever the values, whatever their emphasis are, there's also the fundamental value of preserving executive flexibility. It's, day-to-day foreign policy, national security policy is difficult. Arms sales are into that. Every case is unique and has considerations, and in trying to restrict that is going to be a problem for any administration, Democrat or Republican, that comes in. So it's not going to be a lot of receptiveness to that just off the top. There needs to be, however, a greater role and of transparency in the administration. I personally would like to see the Congress, certainly in my committee and our sister committee in the House, to be involved in the process a lot earlier. One of the problems that we have is that we are at the end of the process. There can be months of interagency deliberations going on between Defense Department and State Department and this, that, and the other ones. And then when it finally comes to us, then we start our process anew. We are at the end of it. If we were somehow incorporated at the beginning of the process or the middle of the process, and people who are from the administration are probably fainting right now to hear me say this, to actually be involved in the internal process, to offer opinions and concerns, the process could actually move more efficiently, because then we're not having to back it up when we get the problematic sales of starting over from our point of view.
Yeah, if I could add to that too. I mean, I think this also gets to a point that David made, and that is really enshrined in some ways in the Menendez bill, which is that the executive branch is also not a monolith. Right? In theory, the reason that our bureaucracy works, depending on who you ask, is that ideally it works through a democratic process where you have, a bureau that focuses on human rights, and you have a bureau that focuses on security cooperation and what have you, and that all of those interests are taken into account. So what we're saying with this agenda is not, for, to one of the questions here, cut DOD out of the process. It's how do we actually make sure that all the other voices that are supposed to be heard are heard, right? How do we make sure that DRL, when DRL is waving their hands about human rights concerns, that they're heard, and not just that they're heard because they have to check a box, but because, making sure that US arms are not fueling conflict or causing harm abroad is and should be a fundamental interest of the United States.
And if I could just put this in a really quick historical perspective, Congress in the past has been far more involved in decisions by the executive branch. And since pretty much the Gingrich revolution, Congress has done what I think Lorelei Kelly called a self, what's the word for when you scramble your brains? Anyway, gosh, it's just left my head. But anyway, by getting rid of the Office of Technology Assessment, by getting rid of all the caucuses and all the support mechanisms that we've had, and really vastly reducing the number of committee staff and so forth, Congress has weakened itself in its relationship with the administration. So yes, absolutely, the administration is not going to want Congress to assert itself more, but it's only going back to maybe a status quo ante. This is not something totally new.
I want to pick up on that, Diana, because I think you mentioned in your initial remarks that Congress wants to hear from its constituents. And there's a couple of questions about sort of the role of civil society. And I would expand that to not just sort of organized civil society, but really sort of your everyday American who's outraged that their tax dollars are being used to perpetuate human rights abuses. But what is it that civil society or people can do? And there was one question about whether or not it was effective to have the actual individual arms manufacturers that were responsible for making the weapons that were then used in, say, the Yemen strike, the bus strike that killed school children? Like, was that an effective tool? Like, is it that we need to outreach people more? Is that what we need to do? Or is it that we need people to actually, A, care about these issues and then do something about it, right? So I think, as you said in your comments, Diana, when you ask people, they always sort of say, yes, this is a terrible idea. But when it comes down to doing something about it. And so I guess the question would be from that, once we talk about what civil society can do and what is impactful, is that's what's needed to sort of flip the switch flip the script or flip the switch on Congress to do something, right? Is that all we need, is for people to be outraged and call their members of Congress, or is that still not going to be enough? So putting both of those questions together as we're running low on time.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I do think that there's some value in packaging this together with larger issues of the militarization of US foreign policy, which also connects with a militarization of domestic policy, and having people understand the racism and white supremacy that's leading us to do many of these policies and address it in a holistic way. And I think that you are able to get more people to voice concern about this when they see the big picture instead of one instance where it comes out, which is in arms sales abroad. And the other part is in packaging it with other issues of congressional role and congressional authority. So, for instance, war powers and these authorizations for use of military force. People are sick of sending their kids to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and everywhere else around the world. The US is engaged in counterterrorism operations in 80 countries around the world. And I think people are seeing that this isn't working. And so I think Congress is actually hearing from a lot of people about this and the desire to end this way of relating to the world. And the flip the script legislation is actually packaged together with portions that will change the balance on war powers and also national emergencies.
If I could add to that too, the flip the script idea and some of the other measures that we have in the report, like increasing transparency, right? Those are in some ways also meant to provide the opportunity for civil society and the public to have a moment to mobilize around concerning sales and essentially get the same opportunity that industry already gets constantly, right? To have an opportunity to, whether it's go to your congressperson, call them on the phone, whatever it is, depending on who you are, the opportunity to stop sales that are concerning to you. And then the other thing is, I think, dismantling the arguments for arms sales that the Trump administration and industry so often make, right? So the Trump administration and arms manufacturers, I believe, are misleading the American public about the economic impact of arms sales, right? And we've talked a lot about today the way that it's pitched as an economic transaction rather than a foreign policy one. There's research by the Security Assistance Monitor that shows that by the most generous estimates, total US arms sales related jobs equal 0.2% of the US labor force. The Cost of War Project also did a fantastic report on this, finding that job creation through defense spending lags behind comparable investments in things like clean energy and infrastructure, education, healthcare, et cetera. I have a lot more statistics here that I won't rattle off, but needless to say, it is a bogus argument. And I think that educating the American people on and voters on that issue, and I think that that's also a really important way to go.
Well, I'd like to sort of stick up a little bit for the members of Congress, actually. There are a lot of them that are very, very concerned about how weapons can be misused and by whom. Oftentimes, it's directed at particular countries that already don't have a lot of friends or had a great reputation. And on that, you can get sort of a surprising degree of agreement on whether or not arms sales of a particular type to that country is a good idea. And through that, actually, you can start generalizing out from that. I would also say that a lot of the companies, at least at the Washington level, are aware of reputational risks involved in their products being misused by foreign countries, and they are concerned about that. But there are so many other countervailing tendencies in that, and how the whole economic model for our own military production has developed and is dependent on the health of some relatively few companies, and how they get the funds to develop things. And once then the U.S. appetite for those weapons is satisfied, at least for the time being, how to keep the production lines open, how to keep the development going, how to, turn a profit and move on and finance the next thing. It's all bound up in the decisions of the absolute necessity to sell abroad. And that also extends sometimes into our own government as to how it wants to acquire certain things, that it gets a lower price if it goes for a larger production run, which means you sell something to somebody. So there's the quantity of scale comes in and you get a smaller unit price, which it doesn't happen all the time. It does happen. It shouldn't be part of the consideration, but there's so many things that are bound up here. And I think there's a really need for a real holistic view of how this whole economic, developmental, manufacturing base is intertwined to be able to get at the points and where human rights can matter more in this, without looking like you're taking on the entire industry and therefore having problems politically in doing what you're trying to do.
So I realize that we're very low on time. And so I'm going to ask one last question that will serve as your opportunity to say whatever you didn't feel like you got to say in the last hour and 25 minutes. But in David's presentation, he mentioned sort of that the Senate discovered this joint resolution as an existing authority. And all of what we've talked about today, even if you take some of these reforms on their own, it's a very ambitious agenda. And we talked about sort of really needing to shift political culture, both at the congressional level and at the executive branch level, to be able to undertake these reforms. So I'm wondering if there's anything that, if you had sort of a magic wand that wouldn't require sort of massive reforms or a huge new piece of legislation that Congress could, that maybe it already exists even, that Congress could take more advantage of to put human rights and the mitigation of civilian harm sort of more front and center. Is there something that you would do? And if you don't like that question, then you can just give your last sum up comment, but each of you maybe 1.5 minutes to answer. We'll start with Diana. We'll go in reverse order this time.
Well, there's one thing that could happen right away that doesn't require any changes of law or anything else. And Congress could just publish, like the committees could publish on their websites, all the arms sale notifications that come through. They could just make that information available to everyone, right from the beginning, and then there would be an opportunity for civil society to weigh in on some of these decisions. I recognize that there's this desire for pre-notification so that Congress knows before anyone else and they have time to make a decision. But I know when I was on the Hill, I actually found it quite helpful to have input from the outside before I had to make that call. So I'll just put that out there as an supposedly easy one.
Thanks, Diana. David?
Thank you, Diana. A slight alteration of that is that one that would be very easy to do would be for the administration and State Department to actually not only publish everything at congressional thresholds on a real-time basis on its own website, but everything it sends out the door. It's been estimated that 90% of what's sold in the arms sales process is not notified, does not trip threshold, and is not notified to Congress. So it would be terrific to see all of that that's just out there in real time on the State Department's webpage, on the Defense Security Cooperation Agency's webpage, which actually, by the way, DSCA does do that at the threshold value, but put everything out there when it's formally noted, at least when it's formally notified to Congress, if not before. And so everybody would then be able to look at that during the 30 or 15 days and then be able to exercise, their citizenship rights to contact their representatives and to opine on whatever the heck that it happens to be. It would also be nice to, frankly, see what's going out under other authorities, because it's not just the Arms Export Control Act Title 22 authorities where things are transferred to foreign countries. There are Title 10 authorities, and they seem to be increasing all the time, of things so that end up with lethal weapons going to people without going through the normal arms sales process as well. So that can be done, legislatively. It would be very simple to do, just a simple mandate to do that, and would satisfy that as well.
And David, can I just tack onto that this should be in machine readable form? So right now it all comes out in PDFs that anybody who's trying, like the Security Assistance Monitor, wants to try to keep track of this, and they have to physically retype everything because they can't use the data that's put out there.
Yes, let me just echo: transparency, good; readability, usability, even better. That they go hand in hand. Annie, quickly to you.
Yeah, I would kind of echo what David said in the sense that about half of what's in this report, if not more, are things that the executive branch could decide to do tomorrow on their own without Congress having to tell them to do it. So I would love for them to do all of those things. And as I mentioned, there are people in the State Department trying to do some of these things that need support to do those and need that congressional backing. If I could choose one, I would choose applying the Leahy law, interpreting that law correctly and applying it to arms sales. And then I also just wanted to say really quickly too, to David's point about non-AECA authorities essentially that transfer arms. There's also, obviously a huge connection to be made between our arms export regime and the transfer of arms domestically. Our domestic arms market, the 1033 program, things like that are arming police that we're seeing, with mine-resistant vehicles in the streets, for example. So I'll close with that.
Well, thank you. And you've all, unbeknownst to you, you've given me a great segue to sort of advertise our next program, which I will do. But I do want to thank all of you. I apologize to those of you who got in questions that I didn't get to. I was really close this time. But it's just a testament to how broad and widely, how much wide interest there is in this topic, that we could keep going. And I'm really appreciative of everyone giving an hour and a half of their time, because I know how busy everyone is, and it's the end of the school day, and it's just challenging for those of us working at home with kids finishing and trying to figure out what to do. So thank you very much for all of you for joining us, and to our panelists, who I'm not only, in awe of your knowledge and your expertise, but really admire your continued commitment to trying to see some of these reforms push through, despite years of sort of hitting a wall on this. And I do hope that all of you are right, that we're at a sort of unique time in our history, that we can see these changes, at least maybe not in the next few months, but hopefully in the next Congress. So don't forget to download this report, the Great Power Report. And if you're really interested in how this story continues, there's a trilogy episode coming up on November 19th, where CIVIC and Stimson will be launching a new report called Exception to the Rules, Civilian Harm and Accountability in the Shadow Wars, which is going to look at the growth of activities overseen by the CIA and Special Operations Forces as a proportion of the US government's operations involving lethal force abroad. So I think talking about transparency and sort of where US weapons and US force is being used around the world, I think this is a very timely report. So please join us on November 19th for that event. This presentation will be available on our website if you missed parts of it. Thank you all for joining us today, and wishing you all continued good health, safety, and resiliency in this very challenging time. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Thanks everybody for joining.